It was a chilling night during our camping expedition with the Girl Scout troop. I huddled inside the tent with a couple of fellow scouts, the darkness outside pressing in on us. The air was thick with an eerie silence, broken only by the unsettling howls that echoed ominously around our campsite. We froze in fear, realizing there was a coyote lurking in the shadows, its haunting call sending shivers down our spines. In that moment, the wilderness felt like a foreboding and hostile realm. As if the coyote's haunting presence wasn't enough to unsettle us, a sinister twist of fate brought us face to face with another threat. A skunk, black as night, darted past our tent, its beady eyes reflecting an unsettling glint. The fear of being sprayed by the noxious liquid hung heavy in the air. We held our breath, praying that the skunk wouldn't unleash its vile weapon upon us. It was a tense, heart-pounding encounter that left us trembling with trepidation. But the worst was yet to come. In the dead of night, an eerie silence enveloped our campsite once more. We awoke to a bizarre, gut-wrenching discovery: something or someone had invaded our camp and made off with our precious food supplies. Panic washed over us as we pieced together the grim truth: a bear, a colossal, shadowy figure lurking in the darkness, had raided our camp, leaving behind a trail of destruction and disbelief. The primal terror of knowing that a formidable predator had infiltrated our sanctuary left us questioning our very survival. That night, our camping trip transformed into a harrowing ordeal, a chilling reminder that the wilderness could be a place of both wonder and terror, where the line between adventure and fear was as thin as the canvas of our flimsy tent. It was May 1st, the day when my friends and I embarked on our annual camping trip. We were filled with excitement, ready to dive into the wilderness with a supply of beer and all the gear we needed for a good time. The clock struck 5 in the morning, and we set off into the dark forest, heedless of the bustling crowd that had gathered around us at the camping site. As we ventured deeper into the woods, the distant echoes of music continued to haunt us, even though we were far from the other campers. It wasn't until the sun began to set around 7 or 8 p.m. that the music suddenly ceased. We assumed our fellow campers had retired for the night, and the silence was a welcome relief. My friend, craving a lighter, decided to approach the neighboring campsite, but to our astonishment, it was deserted. We eventually found a lighter and handed it to him, and for a while, everything seemed normal. But then, as the night deepened, around 10 p.m., eerie sounds began to infiltrate the forest. It was the chilling sound of girls laughing, accompanied by the unsettling sensation of something running through the trees. Fear crept into our hearts, but we attempted to dismiss it as some girls playing around. We turned to our beer to calm our nerves. As we consumed the alcohol, the fear gradually subsided, and we let our guard down. Despite the limited supply of 30 beers for the 10 of us, we felt the warmth of inebriation. However, just as we were becoming intoxicated, the forest seemed to come alive. The ominous sound of footsteps drew nearer, and we scrambled for shovels, knives, and anything we could find to defend ourselves. Our hearts pounded with terror, but when we looked around, there was no one to confront. We huddled in our campsite, trembling in the darkness, as the inexplicable footsteps continued to encircle us. We dared not speak, convinced that a bear or something equally sinister lurked in the shadows. We prayed for the night to pass uneventfully. When morning finally broke, my friends and I cautiously scanned our surroundings, only to find that the forest was empty once more. The unsettling realization that there had been no one there to account for the bizarre events of the night left us with an enduring sense of dread. We may never know who or what had haunted us in that forest, but one thing was certain: the memory of that night would haunt our dreams for years to come. A couple of years back, my partner and I embarked on a weekend camping trip deep within the eerie confines of Unearthly National Forest. As a gay couple, I couldn't shake my apprehensions about venturing into the heart of nowhere, but the presence of our two vigilant pit bull rescues offered some comfort. We reckoned that any suspicious inquiries about two men sharing a tent could be quelled by our four-legged companions. Luck was on our side that day. No other soul occupied the desolate campsite we stumbled upon. We picked the perfect spot, a small clearing nestled amidst the vast, foreboding expanse of the national forest, and set up our tent. After a strenuous hike with our dogs, we returned to our campsite as darkness swallowed the land. In the dim twilight, we dined by the fire, enjoying a few beers and engaging in light-hearted chatter. Something peculiar hung in the air. Our dogs, usually boisterous, were eerily attentive, their senses acutely attuned to the shadowy wilderness surrounding us. I attributed it to their unfamiliarity with this alien realm, exacerbated by our slightly inebriated state. Time drifted away, and as the clock neared midnight, we sought refuge in the tent. Just as I drifted into slumber, I was rudely awakened by the menacing growls of our dogs. I dismissed it as nocturnal forest critters scavenging for scraps. This occurred repeatedly throughout the night, growls, shuffling, and twig snapping outside the tent. Each time, I urged the dogs to silence their vigilance and return to sleep. But then, my partner's panicked voice shattered the stillness of the night. He urgently shook me awake, his eyes wide with terror, a trembling finger pressed to his quivering lips. In the pitch darkness, I could barely discern his desperate whisper, "Listen." I strained my ears and heard it, a haunting, unnatural wail emanating from the woods to our left. It began as a low, guttural moan, gradually ascending into a piercing, otherworldly shriek. A chill crept down my spine as the dogs fell silent, their eyes locked on the impenetrable darkness beyond. I, a rational biologist, scoured my mind for logical explanations. Yet, nothing in my extensive fieldwork experience could account for that spine-chilling cry. It wasn't the call of any known creature. No deer, bobcat, or owl could produce such a ghastly sound. The eerie moan repeated itself several times, seemingly moving through the forest to our left. After a heart-pounding silence, we unzipped the tent's door just enough to peer into the black void. Nothing. But dread clung to us, and a whispered debate ensued in the inky shadows. Fear urged us to flee, and we finally yielded to its insistent grasp. With trembling hands, we gathered the dogs and fled to our car, parked nearby. Panic surged as we desperately tried to start the engine, but all we heard was the mocking click of a dead battery. Adrenaline gave way to grim reality. Locked in the cold embrace of the night, we weighed our options. After a hushed debate, we made a perilous decision, to venture back into the sinister woods, searching for fellow campers who might possess jumper cables or a portable charger. Our dogs, vulnerable in the car, were left behind. We navigated the obsidian wilderness, our cell phones offering feeble beacons of light. My rationality battled with primal fear as we trudged through the sinister darkness, each step echoing our vulnerability. I anticipated a monstrous abduction lurking in the shadows, ready to snatch us away at any moment. Finally, we stumbled upon a lone camper, who, to our immense relief, possessed jumper cables. While he assisted us, I hesitantly inquired about the strange noises. He claimed ignorance, insisting nothing unusual had occurred in the woods that night. We hurriedly left, leaving behind the unsettling enigma, fleeing the cursed forest that had swallowed us whole. To this day, that unearthly sound remains unexplained. I've considered the tales of Bigfoot sightings in Unearthly but remain haunted by the enigma of that night. I'm thankful I knew nothing of skinwalkers then, for I might have succumbed to sheer terror. A few years ago, my boyfriend and I decided to celebrate our birthdays in a truly adventurous way, by embarking on a camping trip to a remote northern Canadian park. It had become a tradition of sorts, and we cherished these excursions into the wilderness, where the only company we had was the rugged beauty of the natural world. But little did we know that one particular trip would etch an unsettling memory into our souls. The journey began as any other, with excitement bubbling inside us as we packed our gear, bracing ourselves for the unique challenges of camping in the harsh northern climate. The air was noticeably colder than on previous trips, and the promise of frigid nights under a star-studded sky filled us with both anticipation and trepidation. As we ventured deeper into the park, the solitude enveloped us. There was something eerie about being the sole inhabitants of this vast wilderness. We could go days without encountering another soul, and this solitude, while serene during the day, could feel ominous when nightfall descended like a heavy shroud. It was on one of those long, dark nights that our adventure took a nightmarish turn. I remember it vividly. It was around 3 a.m. when I suddenly awoke, shivering from the cold. I tried to nuzzle closer to my boyfriend for warmth and comfort, but as I turned, I was struck by a sound that sent a shiver down my spine, an unsettling, low-pitched humming noise that seemed to penetrate my very bones. My boyfriend's silhouette lay next to me, oblivious to the disturbing hum that had invaded our tent. Still half asleep, I tried to dismiss it as a product of my imagination, but then, something happened that shattered any hope of reassurance. A brilliant, blinding light pierced through the thin fabric of our tent. It was as if the very heavens had torn open and poured an otherworldly radiance upon our campsite. I could see everything outside with uncanny clarity, the picnic table, the trees, the outline of our truck, all bathed in a surreal glow that defied explanation. Fear gnawed at my heart, and my body tensed involuntarily. My gaze remained fixed on the surreal illumination, my mind racing to rationalize the inexplicable. And then, the horror deepened. A figure, a shape beyond my comprehension, materialized outside our tent. Panic surged through me like an electric shock. I wanted to scream, to wake my boyfriend, but my voice betrayed me, and I found myself paralyzed in the grip of sheer terror. The figure was unmistakably human, yet grotesquely distorted. It had a head, but it was unlike any head I had ever seen, oversized, almost bull-like, and strangely misshapen. As I watched in paralyzed horror, it floated towards us, moving with an eerie grace that defied gravity. Every instinct screamed at me to flee, but I was trapped, a helpless observer of this surreal nightmare. Seconds stretched into an eternity as the figure hovered ominously over us, its unsettling presence casting a malevolent shadow across our very souls. The cold sweat that drenched me seemed to freeze in the frigid air. And then, with no warning or mercy, I blacked out. It's essential to note that I had experienced sleep paralysis in the past, but this episode felt different. I had not been under any unusual stress or anxiety, and my sleep paralysis had been dormant for years, making this encounter all the more inexplicable and horrifying. Morning broke, casting the campsite in the soft, forgiving light of day, but the eerie memory of that night lingered like a haunting specter. We hastily packed our belongings and left the park, our minds haunted by the fear that whatever had visited us in the dead of night might return. To this day, the inexplicable remains etched in our memories, an unsettling chapter in our otherwise cherished camping adventures. In the summer of 2013, two of my closest friends and I embarked on an epic road trip from Illinois to California. We'd been on the road for over a week, camping at various breathtaking sites along the way, and our final destination was the majestic Yosemite National Park. One fateful night, exhaustion overcame us as we attempted to drive through the dark, winding roads of California's forested landscape. We desperately sought to arrive at Yosemite by morning. Our fatigue became unbearable, and we decided to pull off the road in search of a quiet spot to catch a brief nap. Our tired eyes scanned the desolate surroundings, and we stumbled upon an eerie, empty church parking lot. The only source of light was a single, flickering parking lot lamppost. Megan and I ventured into the ominous field, shrouded in tall, whispering bushes, to relieve ourselves before settling in for some much-needed sleep. As we reclined in our seats, with the windows slightly cracked to allow in the warm summer air, we had only been trying to sleep for a mere 5 minutes when it happened. A chilling sound pierced the silence, an eerie, distant coin-like flick, landing on the gravel roughly 10 feet from our car. A collective shiver coursed through our exhausted bodies as we tensely waited, our hearts pounding in our chests. Then, another disturbing flick, but this time it sounded as if it landed right beside our car. Panic seized us. I grabbed a mini baseball bat, my fingers trembling, while Taylor started the car, rapidly adjusting her seat, and Megan forcefully shifted the car into drive. We peeled out of that accursed parking lot and sped away in a cocoon of silent fear, not daring to look back. After about 20 minutes of white-knuckle driving, we found refuge at a well-lit gas station that allowed for overnight parking. We huddled together, shaken and wide-eyed, discussing the unnerving incident. We realized there were no nearby houses or side streets by that ominous church, making the whole ordeal even more inexplicable and unsettling. The following morning, during a tense breakfast conversation, Megan revealed a bone-chilling detail that sent shivers down our spines. As we sped away from that sinister parking lot, she had glanced back and witnessed a disturbing sight. In the dim, flickering light, she saw a figure standing in the field of menacing bushes. The silhouette was the size of a child, yet the face, illuminated eerily by the parking lot light, appeared to belong to an elderly man, with a malevolent and unsettlingly wide smile. Megan wasn't the type to scare easily or have an overactive imagination, which made her account all the more terrifying. We were left with more questions than answers. Perhaps it was just a mischievous wanderer playing a cruel prank on weary travelers, or perhaps something much darker lurked in the shadows that night. One thing was certain, we were fortunate to have left that night with nothing more than a spine-chilling story to recount. I was just a young boy, around 12 years old, on a camping trip deep in the eerie wilderness of South Florida. It was a chilling evening, and despite the darkness that enveloped the woods, the winter's chill hadn't fully set in yet. The air was thick with anticipation as we gathered for a weekend of fossil hunting and outdoor adventure, surrounded by families from all around. One fateful night, nature called, and I found myself reluctantly trudging out into the oppressive darkness to use the bathroom. The surroundings were shrouded in inky blackness, and the oppressive silence sent shivers down my spine. Little did I know, the older kids had decided to engage in a game called Manhunt, a sinister twist on tag and hide-and-seek. As I emerged from the bathroom, vulnerable and disoriented, I heard an ominous voice pierce the silence, chilling me to my core. "I'm gonna get you," it bellowed, sending a cascade of dread down my spine. In that instant, I was engulfed in pure terror. Unseen footsteps pounded toward me from the obsidian shadows, their rapid approach a haunting echo in the night. I had no idea what was happening, no inkling that it was just a part of the game. All I knew was that I had to flee, to escape this impending nightmare. I cried out in sheer panic, my screams echoing through the dark forest as I sprinted wildly, my heart pounding like a drum. In the midst of the chaos, I envisioned a horrifying scenario, as if I had stumbled into a malevolent Friday the 13th nightmare. Eventually, the older kid chasing me realized their mistake, and the game was exposed for what it was. They felt overwhelming remorse and promptly apologized to my parents. There was no lingering resentment, but the scars of that night ran deep. To this day, the memory lingers, a haunting reminder of the primal fear I felt that night in the unforgiving wilderness. The mere thought of someone chasing me is enough to trigger a surge of adrenaline, a testament to the enduring trauma that has stayed with me from that nightmarish encounter. Last summer, me and two of my closest buddies embarked on a camping trip near a desolate, eerie lake. We set up camp, devoured dinner, and began the night with roaring laughter around a crackling fire. Spirits were high, but the tranquility was about to be shattered. As we sat, sharing tales of the lake's grim reputation for claiming lives, an unsettling unease settled upon us. Some claimed it was a haven for those seeking to end their torment, while others whispered of its treacherous depths, hidden by tangles of weeds and mud. It started innocently enough, a few distant, bright lights on the other side of the lake. We dismissed them as fellow campers, lost in their own revelry. But then, those lights began to grow, approaching us with malevolent intent. The light sped towards us at an unnatural pace, defying the restrictions that banned motorboats on the lake. Before we could react, they were upon us, an overpowering blaze that swallowed us whole. It was as if we were trapped in a blinding abyss, robbed of our senses. Time itself seemed to warp and twist. My friend, idly smoking by the fire, suddenly screamed as his cigarette vanished in seconds, burning his fingers to the bone. We had lost precious minutes we couldn't remember. Our cigarettes, too, had mysteriously vanished. Then came the strangest part. My burned friend, inexplicably, waded into the lake, his screams mixing with the night's eerie symphony. My other friend followed suit, hypnotically drawn into the water's depths. Desperation gripped me as I struggled to reach them, but the lake's thick, murky grip held me back. I plunged into the water, gasping for air, but the lake's filth filled my mouth. I reached my friend first, slapping him until he snapped back to reality. He had no memory of his strange behavior. But my other friend, he ventured deeper into the lake, oblivious to our pleas. We rescued him, but the experience left scars that haunt my nightmares. Visions of me sinking into those dark, abyssal waters, an ominous light above me growing dimmer and dimmer. The lake was far more treacherous than we ever imagined. As for the mysterious light, whether it was paranormal or extraterrestrial, it remains an enigma. I'll never return to that wretched lake, leaving behind our possessions in our hasty retreat. The memory of that terrifying night still lingers, a chilling reminder of the unknown horrors that lurk in the shadows. Last winter, I ventured on a chilling camping trip with my work buddies to a remote spot deep within the untamed wilderness. This land had long been forgotten, its owner, my colleague's uncle, having passed away years ago. With each passing summer, it grew wilder and more ominous. We pitched our tent by the icy riverbank, the terrain proving rougher than we had expected. The campfire provided the only feeble light in the oppressive darkness of the surrounding dense forest. We reveled in the seclusion, our laughter echoing through the eerie silence of the night. But as the hours grew darker, our mirth gave way to dread. My colleague's attention shifted away from me, drawn to something lurking just beyond our campsite. A dark silhouette, the shape of a human, emerged from the shadows. The night was so dark that the campfire barely revealed its presence. Tension gripped the air, and my colleague, the land's rightful owner, grew anxious. This intruder had no business being here, and we could only watch in dread as the shadowy figure seemed to hear our hushed whispers. It retreated into the abyss. My colleague's determination flared. "I need to sort this out," he declared, bravely crossing the rickety bridge to the other side of the river. We were left behind, vulnerable and anxious. The sounds of the forest surrounded us as we anxiously awaited his return. Minutes passed, and we heard his footsteps fade into the distance. Then, unexpectedly, we heard footsteps approaching our campsite, but they changed direction and retreated into the darkness. A colleague yelled out, but the footsteps transformed into a frenzied run toward the woods, sending shivers down our spines. Finally, the missing camper returned, claiming he found nothing, dismissing our tales of strange footsteps and eerie noises. Unease hung heavy in the air, and we felt increasingly unsafe. As we heard more unsettling sounds from the woods, including footsteps and thrown rocks, we decided it was time to leave. Whoever was out there knew the land better than us, and we weren't willing to stick around to find out what horrors lay in wait. We packed up in haste and retreated, leaving behind the sinister unknown. The chilling encounter still haunts my dreams, and I'm thankful we escaped whatever malevolent presence lurked in the depths of that unforgiving wilderness. It was many years ago, during the eerie embrace of autumn when the world itself seemed to hush to a sinister whisper. My parents had announced a camping trip, a seemingly ordinary adventure that would soon unravel into a tale of spine-tingling dread. My best friend and I ventured deep into the heart of Wakayama Prefecture, our hearts filled with youthful excitement. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the village, we set up our tents by the edge of a tranquil river. The crimson hues of twilight heralded the descent into a night that would haunt our very souls. Darkness crept upon us like a malevolent spirit, shrouding the world in obscurity. It was then, as we huddled together inside our flimsy shelter, that the first ominous sign manifested. My friend turned to me with wide, fearful eyes and whispered, "Can you hear that?" A haunting, dragging sound clawed its way into our consciousness from the outside. The tent's zipper revealed nothing but an inky abyss, yet the ghastly noise persisted. It was as if something unseen was dragging itself slowly, purposefully, around our tent. We mustered the courage to step outside, hearts pounding like distant war drums, only to be met with a chilling void. There was no one in sight, no logical explanation for the dreadful sound that seemed to encircle us, as though mocking our vulnerability. Returning to the tent, our dread multiplied. The moment we sealed ourselves inside, the nightmarish dragging sound resumed, louder and more unsettling than before. It resembled footsteps, but no sane person could make sense of it. Each pass around the tent sent shivers down our spines. We tried to dismiss it, convincing ourselves that it was a mere trick of the night. Illuminating our surroundings with lanterns and a feeble campfire, we proceeded with preparing dinner, desperate to distract ourselves from the looming terror. During our meal, the eerie noise remained conspicuously absent. Our unease waned, if only for a fleeting moment. But the malign presence that haunted us had not relented, it merely lay in wait, biding its time. As the hour grew late, we reluctantly retreated to our tent, praying for reprieve. Yet, as we crawled into our sleeping bags, the dragging sound resumed with an insidious persistence. Like a malevolent specter, it circled us, an unseen tormentor. We clung to each other in the oppressive darkness, our minds unraveling with fear. We checked the perimeter of the tent over and over, only to find nothing but the oppressive blackness of the night. Eventually, exhaustion overcame our terror, and we dared to hope for respite in slumber. In that accursed tent, beneath the malevolent gaze of an unseen presence, we drifted into restless dreams. Morning brought relief in the form of silence. Our ordeal had seemingly ended, and we believed ourselves to be free from the nightmarish clutches of the unknown. We began packing our belongings, preparing to leave this cursed place behind. But as we dismantled the tent and peered beneath, dread took hold of us once more. Hidden beneath our shelter, as though left there by an otherworldly hand, were a pair of ancient, weather-damaged sandals. My heart sank as I recalled the local legend, a tale of an elderly woman who had met her tragic end in the very river by which we had camped. She had perished while searching for her missing sandals. In that chilling moment, the pieces fell into place, and the dread returned with an intensity beyond words. The dragging sound, the inexplicable footsteps, it was the restless spirit of the old woman, ceaselessly searching for her lost footwear. As we hastily departed that cursed campsite, I couldn't help but wonder if her spirit still lurked nearby, condemned to eternally wander in search of her elusive sandals. The memory of that night will forever haunt my dreams, a reminder that in the depths of darkness, the most malevolent secrets of the world may reveal themselves, leaving us forever scarred by their chilling presence. Many years ago, during a chilling autumn, my parents decided that it was time for a family camping trip. To make it even more exciting, they allowed me to invite a friend along. The anticipation of the adventure filled me with giddy excitement. I knew it was going to be a blast. When the weekend finally arrived, my parents, my friend, and I embarked on our journey into the desolate mountains for our camping excursion. Back then, outdoor camping was not as popular as it is today. So, when we arrived at the campsite, we were taken aback by the eerie absence of other campers. It felt strangely lonely, but the allure of the wild soon overtook me. As a schoolboy, I saw the campsite as our private playground. We played by a nearby river, ventured into the dense woods, and, as night fell, we gathered around a campfire for a barbecue feast. The flickering flames and the sizzle of meat on the grill created a cozy atmosphere, but the surrounding darkness held an ominous undercurrent. Just before bedtime, an unexplainable shift came over my friend. Normally brimming with self-confidence, he appeared haunted as the sun dipped below the horizon. His mood soured, and he began to display signs of homesickness and fear. In the dead of night, tears welled up in his eyes as he confessed his desire to abandon our adventure and return home. By then, however, it was far too late. My parents had indulged in some drinks, and we were all preparing for bed. We reluctantly settled into our tents, the sounds of the mysterious forest enveloping us. It was undeniably eerie out there, alone in the wild, but exhaustion eventually allowed us to drift into slumber. The next morning arrived abruptly, and we decided to cut our camping trip short due to my friend's obvious distress. We packed up our gear and left the campsite while it was still shrouded in darkness. I couldn't recall the exact time, but it felt as though an unspoken urgency had gripped us, compelling us to leave as swiftly as possible. Upon returning home, my parents retreated to their bedroom, claiming they needed a nap. Oddly, I could hear strange noises emanating from their room, far from the usual hushed tranquility of a post-camping nap. However, I was still too drained from the trip to investigate further. Drifting into a restless slumber on the living room sofa while watching early morning cartoons, I suddenly awoke to the shrill ring of the house phone. In those days, we lacked caller ID displays on our phones, so the identity of the caller remained a mystery. I hoped it might be Grandpa, but my parents showed no inclination to answer the call. It continued to ring persistently, unanswered. My curiosity finally overcame me, and I decided to pick up the receiver. "Hello?" I mumbled, my voice groggy with sleep. "Hey there, good morning," a voice on the other end greeted me. It was the voice of a girl, one I couldn't immediately recognize. She sounded roughly my age, or perhaps it was an older woman with a strangely youthful tone. I listened intently, waiting for more. She continued, "Camp was fun last night, wasn't it?" The barbecue was fantastic, especially those succulent shrimp. And oh, I had a good laugh when your usually cheeky and confident friend started tearing up because he was homesick. I sat in silence, paralyzed with confusion. How did this person know such specific details about our camping trip? We were the only 4 people at that campsite. Panic slowly crept in, and I mustered the courage to speak. Who are you? How do you know all this? A heavy silence lingered on the line, broken only by a gasp that seemed to carry a hint of shock. Finally, an unsettling response came, because we were together the entire time. With that cryptic declaration, the line clicked, and the dial tone droned in my ear. I was left alone in the eerie stillness of my home, my heart pounding and my mind racing with fear. In search of answers, I immediately called my friend, suspecting a prank. But he vehemently denied sharing any details of our camping trip with anyone except his parents. He was too embarrassed to even confess his homesickness to them. I approached my parents, their post-nap activities still shrouded in mystery. I questioned them about whether they had given our phone number to anyone or discussed our camping trip, but they assured me they hadn't. The only plausible explanation was that the camping site reservation was the sole source of our phone number. Still, deep within me, a chilling sensation persisted, a sensation that we had been watched that night in the woods. To this day, I cannot forget those haunting words, because we were together the entire time. They linger in my memory, a testament to an inexplicable and sinister encounter from my childhood. When I was just a young boy, barely in elementary school, I embarked on a camping trip that still haunts my memories to this day. It happened during the scorching summer vacation, and our school organized this 2-night camping excursion to a remote campsite nestled deep within the wilderness, a solid 2-hour drive away from the nearest town. While it was technically a campsite, it was far from being well maintained. It had a kitchen and a bathroom, which was a relief, but the rest of the place was shabby, ancient, and more than a little unsettling. The bathroom, if you could even call it that, resembled nothing more than a decrepit outhouse, situated ominously in the middle of a desolate field. Our campsite was surrounded on one side by ominous swampland and on the other by a treacherous cliff. Even as a kid, I couldn't help but think that this was a perilous place for a camping trip. Yet, our teachers assured us that we were perfectly safe, and we believed them. After all, they were responsible for our well-being. During the day, there were plenty of activities to keep us occupied, like hiking and fishing, but it was during the night that things took a dark and eerie turn. The teachers devised a peculiar dare for us, something they called a test of courage. It was unlike any dare I'd ever encountered at that age. We were told to venture into the woods at night, without a flashlight, and remain there in complete darkness and silence until one of the teachers came to retrieve us. They warned us that if we screamed or ran, we'd attract wild animals and risk joining the ranks of the children who had gone missing in these woods. I reluctantly accepted the challenge, feeling a strange mixture of fear and curiosity. As night fell, we ventured into the woods, guided only by our teachers' flashlights. The eerie darkness enveloped us, and all I could hear were the incessant droning of insects and the eerie rustling of leaves in the wind. We reached what I assumed was our designated spot, and then, abruptly, the teachers turned off their flashlights and left, disappearing into the inky blackness. I was plunged into a world of pure darkness, and it felt as if my eyes were closed even when they were open. The air was thick and warm, clinging to my skin like a suffocating blanket. I could hear the occasional rustle of bushes and the distant barking of some unknown creature. I hoped it was distant, but in that pitch-black abyss, it was impossible to gauge distance or direction. I stood there alone, vulnerable, and isolated from the world. Those few minutes felt like an eternity. Suddenly, the flashlights pierced through the darkness, approaching me rapidly. Relief washed over me as I realized the teachers were returning to rescue me. We all made our way back to the campsite together, with the teachers joking about our lucky escape from anything creepy in the woods. The night carried on uneventfully, or so it seemed. The next day, I noticed one of my friends who had undertaken the same dare as I did was clearly distressed. She kept staring at the cliffs with terror in her eyes. When I inquired about what had happened, she whispered in fear, "Can't you see them?" She led me to the edge of the field overlooking the cliffs, but all I could see below was a tranquil stream. She insisted that she could see two children with red faces, but they were invisible to me. She cried and shouted, but no one else could perceive what she saw. The teachers tried to console her, but the mystery remained unsolved. As the night descended once more, I was lying in my sleeping bag, ready to drift off to sleep. The other children around me were still awake, their voices hushed but excited, illuminated only by the faint glow of a lamp. Just as I was on the brink of slumber, their whispers turned tense and anxious. They began speaking of someone in the tent who was in excruciating pain. The girl they were talking about complained of feeling crushed, her chin almost touching the ground as if an invisible weight pressed down upon her. She screamed and cried, sending the entire tent into a frenzy. Teachers rushed in, armed with a bottle of salt. They sprinkled it around and struck the girl's back with their palms, as if performing some kind of exorcism. Miraculously, the girl stopped screaming and stood up as if nothing had happened. It was surreal, as if we had just witnessed something supernatural. After that night, the campsite seemed to regain a semblance of normalcy. We returned home without any further incidents, but the strange occurrences haunted my thoughts. During the bus ride home, I discussed what had transpired with my friends and other groups of kids who had experienced different, equally unsettling events. Some had seen strange figures, while others witnessed eerie shadows that seemed almost human. The memories of that camping trip have never left me. To this day, I'm filled with a sense of unease when I think about it. The mountains, as I came to realize, were a place of mysteries and hidden terrors. I often wonder why I wanted to go on that trip in the first place, and it now feels like a distant, half-remembered nightmare, a memory from the liminal spaces of my childhood, forever haunting me. In the summer of 2009, I embarked on a solo fishing trip to a remote and secluded area. Nestled amidst steep hills and imposing cliff faces, this location seemed like a place where locals rarely ventured. Rumor had it that the river here was teeming with big game fish, and I couldn't resist the lure of the unknown. As I arrived, I was delighted to find that I was the only one who had decided to pitch a tent by the river that weekend. The thought of having this pristine wilderness all to myself filled me with a sense of adventure and excitement. After setting up my camp and enjoying a simple meal, I reclined in my sleeping bag, anticipating an early start to my fishing expedition at daybreak. The night began like any other camping trip, with the soothing sounds of nature enveloping me in their embrace. However, that sense of tranquility was brutally shattered when, in the dead of night, I was abruptly jolted awake by an ear-piercing, bone-chilling sound. I shot up in my sleeping bag, my heart pounding in my chest. For a fleeting moment, I didn't even recognize where I was, that disorienting feeling when you wake up in an unfamiliar place. I strained my ears, trying to make sense of the horrific noise that had roused me from my slumber. It wasn't just the sound, my entire tent was quaking, as if it were caught in the throes of an earthquake. I glanced at my wristwatch. It displayed an ominous 2 a.m. Panic clawed at my mind, but I managed to muster a feeble thought: maybe this was sleep paralysis, a vivid nightmare. I'd heard stories about it, but this felt too real, too visceral. As I lay there, contemplating the possibility of sleep paralysis or auditory hallucination, a spine-tingling realization crawled over me: it couldn't be. A sinking feeling gripped my chest as I considered a more horrifying possibility. My thoughts recoiled at the notion, but it was impossible to ignore: a rock. I had meticulously checked the ground for rocky terrain before pitching my tent. It had been hard and dry due to the summer weather. Yet here it was, the unmistakable sensation of something heavy and unyielding pounding against my tent. The fear was overwhelming, but I couldn't bring myself to entertain the thought of a human presence outside my tent in the dead of night. Alone in the dark wilderness, the idea was too terrifying to confront. Instead, I tried to rationalize the situation, grasping at any plausible explanation to quell my rising terror. But as I wrestled with my thoughts, I heard something outside: a faint, ghostly moan, a wail of anguish and despair. The hair on the nape of my neck stood on end. My body quivered with fear. I felt like I was on the precipice of passing out, but a conflicting emotion surfaced: I couldn't just ignore it. What if there was a person out there in the wilderness, someone who needed help? Despite the fear that gnawed at me, a glimmer of humanity urged me to investigate. With trembling hands, I reached for the tent zipper. The moaning grew louder with each passing second, and I hesitated. Cold sweat streamed down my brow as I cautiously unzipped the tent. In the dim light, I peered outside, scanning the surroundings. But to my bewilderment, there was no one to be seen, only a mysterious, formless shadow that seemed to darken the canvas of my tent. A shiver ran down my spine, my heart raced, and I withdrew back into the tent. It didn't make sense: my tent was illuminated from within by my torchlight. I shouldn't have been able to see a shadow outside. It was utterly unexplainable. Desperation took hold, and I turned on the radio, the familiar voices of the DJ providing a thin veneer of comfort amidst the chaos. But then, as if to mock my feeble attempt at solace, the roof of my tent suddenly caved inward with a deafening crash. The sound of fabric ripping and snapping filled the air, and I felt the sharp pain of something striking me. I was helpless, trapped inside my battered shelter. Panic surged through me, and, unashamedly, I broke down into tears. The realization that this was no dream, no hallucination, was undeniable. The tent, my sanctuary, lay in tatters around me, and I was utterly defenseless. Throughout the long, terrifying night, the moaning outside persisted, accompanied by a new, unsettling sound, a scraping, dragging noise that defied explanation. In my desperation, I cranked the radio's volume to its maximum setting. It was as if the radio was my only line of defense against the malevolent forces that seemed to have descended upon me. Finally, as the first glimmers of dawn began to pierce the night, I felt an overwhelming sense of relief. The sun's warm rays promised safety, clarity, and escape from the nightmare that had unfolded. With trembling hands, I gathered what remained of my ruined campsite and prepared to flee this eerie place. As I surveyed the area in the morning light, I was met with a disconcerting scene. Beer cans, bottles, and flowers were strewn about, as if left by some unseen intruder. But the most chilling discovery of all was the bloodstains that marred the outside of my destroyed tent. It was as if someone, or something, had smeared blood on the cliffs above, silently bearing witness to the night's horrors. My mind raced, seeking an explanation for the events that had unfolded. Had there been a tragic accident here, a lost soul trapped in limbo? Desperate for answers, I left a meager offering, a bottle of juice, as a gesture of peace and a plea for forgiveness. I chose to cling to this supernatural explanation, for the alternative, a malevolent presence toying with me in the wilderness, was simply too terrifying to contemplate. In the end, I retreated from that forsaken place, haunted by the harrowing events of that fateful night, forever changed by an encounter with the unexplainable and the unknown. It was May, and the weather was perfect for an adventure. 3 of my buddies were seasoned campers, but for me, it was my first time with this crew. They had sold me on the idea of an idyllic beach, far from the maddening crowd, promising solitude and serenity. Oh, how wrong we were. We veered off National Highway 51 and ventured down a narrow road, leading us to the desolate beach. As we arrived, we spotted a lone family camper van parked near the entrance. Wisely, we decided to set up our camp about 200 meters away to enjoy some privacy. The day was spent basking on the beach with a few other sun-seekers, but by nightfall, they had all vanished into thin air. It was just us and that solitary family camper van, shrouded in darkness and silence that gnawed at our nerves. Now, I've never been one to fear the dark or indulge in superstitions. But that night, as I lay in the tent, listening to the soothing lullaby of the waves, a sinister presence made itself known. It began as a subtle sound, a distinct and deliberate cadence. Footsteps. Closer and closer, they drew, no more than 5 meters away. There were no lights, no reason for anyone to be here. Panic consumed me as I realized that these were not the steps of a friend or a passerby. They were slow, deliberate, and inhuman. Frozen in my sleeping bag, sweat dripped down my brow. I dared not move, but the footsteps circled our tent, like a predator sizing up its prey. I could feel them, mere centimeters away, circling clockwise, unrelenting. And then, something sinister happened. A prodding, as if a malevolent hand tested the tent's defenses, seeking a way in. The tent's metal poles groaned and creaked under the pressure, filling the air with spine-chilling dread. Desperation set in, but I couldn't summon the courage to wake my friends. I couldn't even leave the safety of my sleeping bag. I clung to a tune in my head, repeating the lyrics and melody, anything to drown out the fear. The footsteps persisted, the circling continued, and the tent strained under the ominous force. I closed my eyes, pleading for the terror to subside. Then, suddenly, it was morning. I rushed outside to relieve myself, foolishly forgetting the horrors of the night. But there, in the sand, were footprints. Footprints that led from the sea to our tent and then back to the sea. I woke my friends in a panic, recounting the night's harrowing events. We wasted no time packing up and fleeing that forsaken beach, seeking solace among other campers and tourists the following night. The memory of those inexplicable footsteps and the malevolent presence that haunted us in the darkness still sends shivers down my spine. It's a chilling reminder that the wilderness holds secrets, some of which are best left undiscovered. I was just a 16-year-old kid, full of youthful courage and curiosity, embarking on an overnight trip into the dreaded Superstition Mountains of Arizona. The ominous shadows that clung to those rugged peaks were enough to send shivers down anyone's spine, but I wasn't about to let fear get the best of me. I won't reveal the trail's name, for the mountains had a reputation for drawing all kinds of dark elements when their secrets were unveiled. My friend had backed out at the last minute, leaving me to venture into the wilderness alone. With my backpack packed and the car engine humming, I set off, eager for the adventure ahead. Little did I know that my ill-fated journey would plunge me into a nightmarish abyss. I arrived at the trailhead far later than I should have, around 5:45 p.m., when darkness was beginning to assert its dominion over the landscape. Experienced backpackers would call this a grave mistake, but youthful impatience pushed me onward. My plan was to make up for lost time and cover at least a couple of miles before setting up camp. As the fading light yielded to inky blackness, my headlamp became my only ally. The dense forest swallowed the path behind me, and the looming Superstition Mountains offered no comfort. The isolation, the eerie rustlings in the underbrush, and the feeling of being watched set my nerves on edge. My heart raced as I decided to halt and set up camp. My feeble headlamp cast a frail circle of light, revealing the sinister wilderness that lay just beyond its reach. I built a small fire, a feeble attempt to push back the encroaching darkness, and opened a can of chili mac to quell my growing unease. Despite my efforts to shake off the creeping fear, an overwhelming sense of dread lingered. Then, out of nowhere, it happened. A small rock, no bigger than a marble, sailed into my camp. I stared at the eerie projectile in disbelief. I knew I was alone. I had to be. Turning my light towards the direction of the throw, I strained my eyes against the tenebrous night, but the thick pines and underbrush concealed any trace of the intruder. Doubt gnawed at me, but I managed to convince myself it was a mere accident, perhaps a stone dislodged by the wind. I resumed my meal, though my appetite had vanished. I couldn't shake the eerie feeling that I was being observed, and the forest's silence was deafening. Hours passed, and I finally succumbed to sleep, hoping to escape the unease that clung to me. The rustling leaves awakened me, barely audible at first. Still groggy, I listened as the sounds grew fainter, like a malevolent presence retreating. Panic gripped me when I reached for my handheld flashlight, only to find it missing. My heart pounded as I scanned the dark void around me. Then, I saw it, a faint glimmer of light deep within the woods. It couldn't have been more than 15 feet away. My flashlight, left beside me when I had dozed off, was now inexplicably beyond the tree line. Terror coursed through my veins as I contemplated the impossible. With my boots on, knife in hand, and my senses on high alert, I faced a chilling choice: stay and endure the night's horrors or brave a treacherous 3-mile hike back to my car in the unforgiving dark. I opted for the former, realizing that the sinister presence out there would have the upper hand if I ventured into the woods without a light. The night wore on, and I listened in dread as the footsteps returned, growing closer with each passing hour. The malevolent stalker seemed to taunt me, moving leisurely as if on a sinister nocturnal promenade. Then, they stopped, mere feet away from my camp. The dwindling fire offered me no solace. I clutched my knife, breathless, and prayed for silence. The world went eerily still, and I remained frozen for hours, the abyss of the night stretching endlessly. At last, the feeble light of dawn broke, and I found myself alone once more. Without a moment's hesitation, I packed my gear and embarked on the 3-mile trek back. Only when I reached the distant, empty dirt road where my car awaited did I feel a fleeting sense of safety. But the horror wasn't over. On my car's dusty back window, a sinister message awaited me: sleep well. That night in the Superstition Mountains, I had ventured too close to something beyond comprehension, a malevolent force that lurked in the shadows, waiting for unsuspecting souls. My advice to anyone is simple: steer clear of those cursed mountains, for something truly sinister resides within. I was just 14 years old, and the eerie memory of that fateful camping trip in the remote wilds of western Maryland still sends shivers down my spine. It was a desolate area on private property, deep in the heart of nowhere. The land was dotted with cabins owned by my mom's family, and it seemed like everyone on that mountain was somehow related to us. Summers in that eerie place were filled with tales of terror spun around a flickering campfire and the wild escapades of my many cousins. But this particular day, the forest held something much darker in store for me. Imagine a nightmarish landscape, a T-shaped road cutting through the wilderness. Above the T, a swift, menacing savage river flowed. If you ventured left on that road, you'd pass by several family cabins, but also confront dense, forbidding woods that swallowed up the road. If you dared to venture all the way to the right, it led to my mom's tiny cabin, the place where we were staying. I was always the kind of kid who preferred solitary exploration, but on this occasion, my solitude was interrupted. My aunt, a towering figure with pink hair, covered in tattoos, and standing nearly 6 feet tall, decided to tag along. She was a bit of a wild child, and she had a joint in hand, wanting to keep out of my grandmother's watchful eyes. I declined the offer of drugs, still too scared of the unknown, and we set off down a rough dirt path into the ominous woods. The river, 150 feet above us, flowed swiftly, and I watched the aquatic life scurry by, blissfully unaware of the impending nightmare. Then, it happened, a click. A sound that dragged me back from the tranquility of nature. My eyes darted around in confusion until they locked onto a figure I'd never seen before. He stood across the river, a mere 15 feet away. He must have materialized from the very shadows of the woods. It was summertime, but he was dressed in a black jacket and ragged jeans, a stark contrast to the vibrant forest. In his hand, an archaic, non-digital yellow camera, the kind you had to wind to take another picture. He smiled at me, and then, chillingly, he aimed the camera at me and clicked it. My voice was stolen by fear, and I took a step back. He advanced, scrolling the top of the camera, and again, the lens was fixed on me. Panic surged through my veins, and I stumbled backward, nearly slipping on a treacherous rock. My aunt, lost in her own world, was a few steps behind, oblivious to the creeping dread that had seized me. Then, the man did something that plunged my heart into a deep abyss of terror. He mimed the unmistakable gesture of drawing a blade from a sheath, then dragged his finger menacingly across his throat. My breath caught in my throat, and in that bone-chilling moment, my survival instincts kicked in. I whirled around and sprinted through the gnarled trees, grabbing my aunt in a desperate grip. My heart hammered wildly, but I swore I heard one more click before the splashing of water behind me. The river, usually thigh-deep, churned with menace. I didn't stop running until we reached the eerie, random staircase that led to nowhere. My aunt yanked me to the other side, and we huddled, gasping for breath. My mind raced as I strained to listen, and the snapping of branches reached my ears, a relentless pursuit through the dense forest. We couldn't stay there. The path back to my family's property was treacherous, winding, and rocky. In our panic, we had no weapons, and every step was fraught with danger, from twisted ankles to menacing snakes that lurked in the shadows. Sobbing and wheezing, we stumbled forward, but the terror had paralyzed my legs. My arms and legs were battered and bruised, and then, disaster struck. I tripped over a branch, slamming my head into a tree. Blood filled my mouth as I tasted the metallic tang of terror. Dazed and battered, I struggled to my feet, leaning against a tree for support. My aunt noticed my absence and scrambled back to me, dropping to her knees in front of me. She urged me to keep moving, and I shivered uncontrollably, my legs trembling like a leaf in a tempest. We pressed on, my aunt's desperation driving us forward. It was a blur until we finally broke free from the woods. My family's cabins were still miles away, and the ominous dusk descended around us. The treacherous, winding roads back to safety taunted us with their menacing shadows. My ears rang with fear, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being followed. My aunt's frantic pleas for us to move faster barely registered in my mind. I couldn't help but glance back, fearing the unknown. The snapping of branches persisted, growing ever nearer. I trembled, my every step marked by pain and terror. We had a long way to go, another mile and a half before reaching my family's property, and another 2 until we found a cabin with occupants. Panic clung to me like a relentless specter, making each step a desperate struggle. Finally, we stumbled out of the woods, collapsing into my grandmother's cabin. The family locked their doors that night, an unusual occurrence in that remote place. No one saw any sign of the man who had terrorized us. To this day, I can't help but wonder if I'm a part of some sinister photo collection, or if something far more sinister awaited me in those dark woods. Given the horrifying possibilities, maybe being part of a chilling collection is the least of my worries. In the chilling year of 1998, I agreed to go camping with an old friend. The excitement turned to dread as we embarked on a grueling journey through the wilderness. My sleep-deprived state only added to the unease. Little did I know, this trip would become a nightmare. As we ventured deeper into the forest, my friend revealed a sinister twist: we had to hike for 2 more hours to reach the campsite. Desperation welled up in me, but my protests fell on deaf ears. The trek started relatively easy, but as time wore on, I grew sluggish, drained of energy. Halfway through, we took a short break, but soon we were back on the treacherous trail. The terrain became steeper, and I stumbled, losing focus. Suddenly, we reached a flat section, and I felt relief wash over me. But my friend was oblivious to the peril lurking beneath my feet. Without warning, I plunged into a hidden pit, surrounded by sharpened stakes. Panic surged through me as I saw the bone protruding from my shin. I pulled myself out, the pain making me queasy. Looking up, all I saw was the blue sky framed by trees. The hole was deep, and there was no escape. My cries for help were met with my friend's laughter. He didn't realize the extent of my injuries, but when I told him, his laughter turned to panic. Attempts to rescue me failed, and it became clear that I needed outside help. Alone, I endured excruciating pain, with nothing but the agony to keep me company. Waves of pain and nausea washed over me. Rain clouds gathered ominously, and soon, the heavens unleashed their fury. I got soaked, but I thought a little rain couldn't harm me. I was wrong. The pit began filling with water, slowly submerging me. Desperation clawed at me as I fought to stay afloat. Praying for the rain to stop, I clung to hope. After a torturous hour, the storm eased, and I relaxed, the water just below my shins. But it was a cruel respite. The rain returned with vengeance, and my refuge turned into a watery grave. The only consolation was that it distracted me from the leg pain. Thoughts of drowning haunted me. Finally, help arrived when the rain subsided, and I was pulled out, water barely below my waist. I shuddered at the thought of drowning in that remote pit. After surgery and a grueling recovery, I yearned to reconnect with my friend, planning a camping trip. But this time, I vowed to stay vigilant, for the woods held secrets far darker than I ever imagined. My name is Jacob, and the tale I'm about to recount will forever haunt my memories. Every Thanksgiving, my family had a peculiar tradition of venturing into the eerie depths of the national forest. My father was a staunch believer in old-school camping, scoffing at anything made of materials other than canvas or leather. Modernity was, in his eyes, synonymous with foolishness. Our trips, it seemed, were cursed to coincide with hunting season. The eerie symphony of gunshots echoed through the woods, reminding us that danger lurked nearby. No one seemed to grasp the peril of allowing 2 young boys, my younger brother, Ethan, and me, to frolic in the wilderness with trigger-happy hunters lurking about. Dawn would break, and Ethan and I would vanish into the dark woods, our imaginations fueled by the likes of G.I. Joe and Rambo movies that had reached the pinnacle of popularity during those days. Our camouflage outfits became our armor, and our games of war echoed through the forest. One particular Thanksgiving, after a morning of daring escapades, I found myself perched on a fallen tree trunk. Suddenly, a deafening gunshot tore through the silence, followed by an ominous whistling sound that grazed past my head. Panic surged through me as I dropped flat on my stomach, waiting for the next shot. I called out for Ethan on our shoddy G.I. Joe walkie-talkies, but there was no response, just a distant, faint moaning. A chill coursed through my spine. Where was he? I called out to him again, my voice trembling, but there was still no answer. Anxiety swelled within me, and I screamed his name into the wilderness. The rustling of leaves intensified, and I bolted towards the source, my heart pounding like a drum. About 20 yards ahead, I froze. I spotted the tip of a Nike sneaker peeking out from beneath a bush. It had to be Ethan's. Racing towards him, my heart sank at the sight that met my eyes. There lay Ethan, his face contorted in terror, a pool of crimson expanding beneath his arm. Panic surged within me, but I masked it. I didn't want to terrify him further. Gently, I scooped him into my arms, despite his weight, and began the agonizing journey back to our camp. He pleaded with me to leave him and fetch help, his voice frail and trembling. I fought back tears and ran, determination fueling every step. By the time my father arrived, carrying Ethan in his arms, I was exhausted and terrified. My mother, in a frantic panic, urged my father on as we raced to the hospital. I clung to my brother, pressing my shirt against his wound, praying he would make it. The hospital became a living nightmare as the hours dragged on. I watched my brother teeter on the brink of life and death. The doctors did their best, but it was touch and go for a long time. I learned later that Ethan had died on the operating table more than once, but somehow, he clung to life. As dawn broke, the detectives arrived, questioning us about the incident. Emotions overwhelmed me as I recounted the harrowing experience. It was the first time I realized that I, too, could have been a victim of that gunshot. Ethan eventually made a full recovery, but the scars ran deep, both physically and emotionally. The police investigation yielded no conclusive evidence. The prevailing theory was that a careless poacher had mistaken our movement for that of a deer. This tragedy was not an isolated incident, as similar accidents had occurred before. We never returned to the national forest for our Thanksgiving tradition. My father believed it was safer to venture to places teeming with tourists and RVs. As I grew older, I appreciated the serenity of camping in peaceful and tourist-friendly destinations like Yosemite and the Grand Canyon. And I'm almost certain that Ethan would agree that this is how camping should have always been, peaceful, quiet, and devoid of lurking danger. My name is Daniel, and the chilling memory of that disastrous camping trip still haunts my dreams. What began as a simple plan to strengthen the brotherly bond between me, Mark, and Jake, soon took a terrifying turn that none of us could have ever imagined. The ominous idea had taken shape in Mark's mind, fueled by an inexplicable urge to venture into the wilderness. It was an idea none of us could shake, as though an unseen force compelled us to embark on this ill-fated journey. On the day we set out, a foreboding mist clung to the trees, obscuring the path ahead. A sense of unease had settled upon us, but we pressed on, driven by an inexplicable force. As we delved deeper into the woods, the once familiar surroundings began to morph into something alien, shrouded in an eerie silence that seemed to sap the very warmth from our souls. By the time night fell, we had reached our destination, a desolate clearing nestled deep within the heart of the forest. Our campfire crackled and spat, casting grotesque shadows that danced upon the trees like malevolent spirits. Though I had been camping numerous times before, the sense of dread that gripped me that night was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. It gnawed at my insides, making my skin crawl and my heart race. As the night wore on, a palpable tension hung in the air. Mark, the most experienced among us, took charge of setting up the tent while Jake and I gathered firewood. The forest seemed to close in around us, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched by unseen eyes. Despite the gnawing unease, we pushed forward, our determination driving us to complete the mundane tasks of setting up camp. Soon enough, we had a roaring fire, and the warmth it provided was a fleeting comfort in the midst of our growing anxiety. Mark's obsession with the campfire was unnerving. He tended to it with a fervor that bordered on the fanatical, his eyes locked on the flames as though they held the secrets of the universe. As I watched him, a sense of foreboding settled over me. We ate in silence that night, our voices swallowed by the oppressive darkness that surrounded us. The forest had grown eerily quiet, as though the very trees held their breath in anticipation of something dreadful. When we finally retreated to the tent, the unsettling feeling of being watched intensified. Each rustle of leaves, each snap of a twig, sent shivers down my spine. I lay there in the stifling darkness, my heart pounding in my chest, as I strained to listen for any sign of danger. Sometime in the dead of night, it happened. A guttural, otherworldly moan echoed through the forest, freezing our blood. It was a sound that defied explanation, a sound that no creature of the natural world could produce. Mark and Jake were paralyzed with fear, their eyes wide with terror as we huddled together in the tent. The moans grew louder, drawing closer, until they seemed to emanate from just beyond the fabric that separated us from the unknown horrors lurking in the darkness. I fumbled for my phone, desperately seeking a signal to call for help, but the device was utterly useless, as though the very air around us had been cursed. The night stretched on, the unearthly moans persisting, each passing minute driving us further into the depths of fear. We clung to one another, our breaths ragged, our minds racing with the unthinkable possibilities of what lurked outside. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, the sound ceased. The silence that followed was even more unnerving, a silence that felt pregnant with malice. As the first light of dawn broke through the trees, we gathered our belongings and fled the accursed clearing, leaving behind the terror of that forsaken night. To this day, we dare not speak of what we heard or what we encountered, for some mysteries are best left undisturbed in the heart of the haunted woods. Late one eerie night, my girlfriend, 2 friends, their husky, and I ventured to the desolate empty Palomar near San Diego. We had gained access to a secluded area owned by the Forest Service, thanks to a key one of us possessed, hidden deep within the dark, towering woods. It was meant to be a tranquil evening under the stars, but it would soon become a nightmarish ordeal. As darkness descended upon us, we huddled around our tents, sharing stories and marveling at the celestial spectacle above. I had brought a high-powered laser pointer to illuminate the constellations, a faint glimmer of comfort in the growing unease that lingered in the shadows. Then, our friend's dog began to act strangely, her hackles raised, growling at something lurking just beyond our sight. We turned to see a figure shrouded in darkness, mere steps away, clad in black, an eerie silhouette against the night. Panic gripped us as we called out, demanding to know why this stranger was here. His response sent shivers down our spines. He claimed the sheriff had given him a ride to spend the night, a tale that reeked of deception. Suspicion hung thick in the air as we reluctantly engaged in conversation, all while secretly passing a knife for protection. My heart raced, the situation was spiraling into a nightmare. We decided to pack up, fear pushing us into overdrive, racing against an unknown malevolence that clung to the night. My girlfriend and I stood guard as our friend unlocked the gate, while our other companion conversed with the sinister stranger. As we worked feverishly to escape, the dog's frantic behavior returned. With a beam of a flashlight, we exposed the intruder attempting to sneak up on us from an unexpected angle. The adrenaline surged, and I prepared to defend my friends, my mind a whirlwind of dread. Yet, somehow, he retreated once more, vanishing into the darkness. We had a brief respite, an opportunity to finish our escape plan. Time was of the essence, and we could feel the clock ticking menacingly. We finally left the eerie campsite, calling 911 to report the unsettling events. To our dismay, the authorities confirmed that no sheriff had transported anyone to the mountain that night. The stranger's deceit was laid bare. As we descended the ominous mountain road, passing the spot where we had camped, we spotted a black car and a shadowy figure peering over the hood. There was no doubt in our minds, it had to be the same man, still lurking in the darkness. Relief washed over us when we reached a gas station next to a casino, taking refuge in the presence of others. That night, the comfort of civilization never felt more reassuring after narrowly escaping a sinister encounter that left our skin crawling. To this day, we have never returned to that accursed mountain, haunted by the chilling memory of that night. I've never forgotten that chilling camping trip when I was just 8 years old. My best friend, Faith, and I had been inseparable since we were toddlers, living on the same street, sharing secrets, and making countless memories. This particular escapade, however, was one that haunted my dreams for years. It all began one dark evening when Faith invited me to join her for a weekend camping adventure at a local campground. Desperate to escape the confines of my own home, I eagerly accepted the invitation. We arrived at the campground around 10 p.m., thinking it would be fun to play a harmless prank on fellow campers by hiding in the bushes and jumping out to give them a good scare. Innocent, right? As we lurked in the shadows, our first few attempts yielded laughter and chuckles from unsuspecting victims. But then, we encountered him, a man who would forever be etched into my nightmares. He was a sinister figure, a white male in his late 40s, towering at around 6 feet, with a medium build and an unmistakable stench of cigarettes and whiskey. As we leaped out from our hiding spot, this man's reaction was unlike any other. He didn't flinch, scream, or even show a hint of fear. Instead, he stared at us with a grotesque, pervy grin that sent shivers down my spine. I was frozen in terror while Faith, sensing the unease, quickly apologized and dragged me away. The night passed somewhat normally, with no further encounters with the unsettling stranger. But as the sun set on the following day, we decided to be carefree children, running around the campsite with joy. That's when we heard it, a chilling yahoo echoing from up the hill. We scanned the area but found no one. In a moment of youthful bravado, I yelled back, "Yeah, you too." And then, we saw him, a figure descending the hill towards us. It was the same man from the night before. This time, I wasn't as scared, my mood was light, and I let him approach us. He inquired about our parents' whereabouts, and Faith replied that they were back at our campsite. The man's grin returned with a vengeance as he said, "Well, it's getting dark. How about I walk you back?" We hesitated, unnerved by his sinister aura, but we didn't want to offend him. Naivety clouded our judgment, and we reluctantly agreed. As we followed behind him, he glanced back repeatedly, that same eerie grin never leaving his face. After about 30 seconds, we reached his campsite. To our dismay, there was no sign of children or bikes. Alarm bells rang inside our heads. He urged us to wait outside his trailer while he fetched something, and fear washed over us. Faith and I exchanged terrified glances, realizing we needed to escape this perilous situation. We bolted for the nearby bushes, hiding ourselves as the minutes ticked by. I watched in horror as the man emerged from his trailer, not with bikes, but with rolls of duct tape. My heart pounded in my chest, and my mind raced as I recalled my parents' warnings about the dangers that lurked in the world. The man's expression morphed from a creepy grin to pure anger as he searched for us in vain. His frantic gaze darted around, but he never spotted us crouched down, concealed in the bushes. He eventually retreated inside the trailer, and that was our cue to flee. We sprinted all the way back to our campsite, too terrified to inform our parents about the sinister encounter. We spent a sleepless night, our young minds grappling with the horrors of what might have transpired. Years have passed since that dreadful camping trip, and the memories still haunt me. It was a nightmarish ordeal that taught us to trust our instincts and never underestimate the sinister intentions that can lurk in the darkness of the unknown. I was just 16 years old when my family decided to embark on our very first camping adventure. The group included my mother, my sister, and my little brother, brimming with enthusiasm and a sense of adventure. Alongside us were our experienced camping companions, my aunt, uncle, and 2 cousins who were no strangers to the great outdoors. Little did I know that what began as a seemingly ordinary camping trip would turn into a chilling tale, etching itself deep into the recesses of my memory. The initial afternoon and evening were surprisingly enjoyable. We set up camp in a picturesque location, surrounded by lush forests and the soothing sounds of nature. We gathered firewood, roasted marshmallows, and shared stories under the starlit sky. It felt like the perfect family outing, and I was beginning to understand why camping held such appeal. As the night drew closer, we retired to our respective tents. My cousins, my sister, and I had set up camp in a large tent, fashioning makeshift beds from sleeping bags and blankets. The forest around us seemed to come alive with nocturnal sounds, the hooting of an owl, the rustling of leaves, and the occasional distant howl. Then, it began. Sometime around 10:30 p.m., we were jolted awake by the unmistakable sound of footsteps. They were slow, deliberate, and unnervingly close, circling our tent. Panic set in as we realized that this was no animal. Someone was out there, moving around our tent. We exchanged alarmed glances in the dim light of our lantern. As the footsteps continued, we strained our ears to listen more closely. Whoever it was seemed to be holding something, a stick, perhaps, and was tracing the contours of our tent as they circled it. Our hearts pounded in our chests, and fear gnawed at our insides. We knew one thing for sure, it wasn't any member of our family. My mother's tracheal breathing was unmistakable, and my little brother could never produce the heavy, deliberate footsteps we were hearing. These were the footsteps of a grown adult. Trying to remain calm, my sister reached out and, with trembling fingers, felt a leg through the thin fabric of our tent. Our breaths hitched as we understood the gravity of the situation. This was no prank by a family member. This was a complete stranger, lurking just outside our tent, separated from us by nothing more than a flimsy layer of fabric. Fear gripped us as we contemplated the stranger's intentions. One of my cousins speculated that it might be their father, known for his fondness for nighttime pranks. But the truth was too unsettling to ignore. We decided to cautiously peer out of the small tent window, which offered a view towards the road situated near our campsite. To our horror, we saw my uncle and aunt approaching our campsite. They were returning from the restrooms, completely unaware of the terror unfolding in our tent. Our blood ran cold as the realization sunk in. the person circling our tent wasn't a family member. It was a complete stranger, and only that thin layer of fabric separated us from them. As our aunt and uncle drew closer to our campsite, we mustered the courage to call out to them. They made their way over to our tent, and we recounted the spine-chilling encounter that had unfolded moments before. The strange activity ceased with their arrival, but the unsettling feeling lingered like a shadow in the woods. We shuddered to think about what might have happened if our aunt and uncle hadn't come when they did. 4 teenage girls in the wilderness, vulnerable and defenseless, it was a terrifying prospect. But, at that moment, we felt a measure of safety in their presence. The rest of the camping trip passed relatively uneventfully, but the memory of that ominous night haunted me. What kind of person would circle our tent like that, and what were their intentions? It was a question that gnawed at my conscience for years to come. The worst part of it all was that our family, our own flesh and blood, didn't take our fear seriously. They brushed it aside as paranoia, leaving us with an unsettling sense of disbelief. To this day, the memory of that camping trip and the sinister encounter with the unknown intruder continues to send shivers down my spine. I've never mustered the courage to go camping again, forever turned off by the thought of what might lurk beyond the thin walls of a tent in the dead of night. The unanswered questions and lingering fear have left an indelible mark on my psyche, reminding me that sometimes, the darkest of experiences can happen in the most serene of settings.